Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. This is the first lesson for Doctrine and Covenants. We're covering Doctrine and Covenants, Section 1. I'm going to do a review of the section itself, look at the theological and historical context, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a show and tell on some of the stuff that I've used over the years and that is available to you as well, and give you just kind of a talk through on what some of these things are. Okay, so in my comments on Doctrine and Covenants through this entire year, when we're talking about stuff, I'm going to use two different terms. I'm going to use the church, and I'm going to use the ecclesia. When I talk about the church, I'm going to talk about the institutional bureaucracy that develops as you work through the Doctrine and Covenants. Initially, there was no church. It was very disorganized. They had no ecclesiastical bureaucracy. They didn't know how to run and operate and handle themselves. And as you work through the Doctrine and Covenants, as time goes on and these various revelations come, the order, the priesthood, the offices, the organization comes and is built over time. So that's whenever I talk about the church, I'm talking about that ecclesiastical bureaucracy. And when I talk about the ecclesia, I'm talking about the people. Okay, so this is the body, the members who attend to the church, and these are two different things. In the New Testament, whenever you read about the ecclesia or the church, it's always talking about the people. It's never talking about the ecclesiastical bureaucracy, and that's something that in the English language has become conflated, and we don't recognize that they're two separate things in the English language. So that's why I want to use these two different words. I want to use the word church for the ecclesiastical bureaucracy. I want to use the ecclesia to talk about the people, the body of believers. Okay, so this is just in an effort to avoid semantic confusion. I'm just letting you know that those are how I'm going to use those terms as we talk about Doctrine and Covenants. Okay, so Doctrine and Covenants, Section 1. This section of the Doctrine and Covenants was received relatively late when compared to other sections it precedes. It was received in November 1831 during a conference when they were talking about publishing the Revelations in book form as the book of Commandments. So there are a number of revelations which preceded this. Obviously, and a number of other revelations were received at the same time as section number 1. It was 67, 68, some of the 60s, and then section 133 as well, were all received during this conference in early November. So for theological context of Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, for an introductory chapter, the text is quite negative. It presents multiple authority statements, themes of divine judgment and punishment, allegations of deliberate apostasy, and a general condemnation of the world when the Lord is talking about Babylon or Idumea. The inexorable nature of the Lord's words are emphasized along with issues concerning his power over and in his servants. Given the negative and authoritative summons rather than a congenial invitation, the reader has to wonder if one of the book's major purposes is to seal the fate of the wicked and the rebellious. So as kind of just as a thought exercise, I went and read through the text of section 1 and just kind of highlighted, in my mind as I was reading along, all of the negative, the nots and the no's and all of the, the negative tone. And the whole section is just filled with it. And then to continue the thought exercise, I then went and reversed the negatives. Like if you rephrase all of the negative statements and the nots and you rephrase it in the positive version, it really changes the tone of this text a lot if you were to do that. Instead of it being, you're not doing this and you're not following the commandments, it becomes a positive, an invitation or an encouragement. and it really changes the tone. So as I thought through this, it makes it clear that this was absolutely intentional on the Lord's part to make this a very negative opening statement as a preface to these books, as the book or the section, these sections of these revelations. Um, Now, if we remember back to the Book of Mormon last year, as it ended up, one of the major themes that's pervasive through the Book of Mormon is the necessity of the gospel going to the Gentiles so that they can carry it to the remnants of Israel, which we see that in Jacob chapter 5, the allegory of the olive tree, right? So, however, the Gentiles in general will reject the gospel in general and the Book of Mormon in specific. And we see this in 1 Nephi 13, Mormon chapter 8, Ether chapter 12. So through the whole book, and specifically towards the end there, when we're reading, the finishing up with Mormon and Moroni, they talk very much about how the Gentiles are not going to generally accept this book that they receive, and it's going to go. The intent is that it go to the remnant of the Lehites. So when we had this very negative opening statement on the heels of reading the Book of Mormon at the end there, it's clear that in this introduction, the Lord is addressing the Gentiles and calling them to account. He's saying, look, this is my word. Here's my scripture. If you reject it, it's on you. This is my word, and turning it down is something that you are going to be held account for. Some more theological context. The text of this section is suggestive of an end times divine confrontation, similar to the Old Testament day of the Lord, or in the New Testament parlance, the second coming. The early church was very much aware of this and anticipated the second coming as imminent. When you also read the text of D&C 133, it has this feel of the Lord coming very soon. I'm hastening the work, and and the church read this kind of thing and they saw it as imminent. Various natural disasters and plagues around the world were documented in the Evening and Morning Star, which was the church's first printed newspaper, and it was seen as evidence of the end times. The lack of timing in the revelations did not deter the early saints from seeing it as imminent. So the Lord never came out and said, next week, next year, or like this is imminently happening. They didn't see it as a continuation of the Old Testament and New Testament rhetoric. They saw it as a new and pressing prediction with an impending fulfillment, which they were an integral part of. This sentiment was not unique to the church at that time. It was relatively common among various Christian sects. So, for example, you had the Millerites, who were contemporary with the early ecclesia. Miller predicted the end time by attempting to use various Old Testament, like Daniel and Revelations, and he mapped it all out, and he said it's happening on this day, and then it didn't happen. And this was the quote great disappointment. Millerism or Milleritism then kind of turned into the Seventh-day Adventist movement. So the early ecclesia, this kind of feeling that the second coming was imminent was common at the time. There's plenty of other churches who believed this. There's plenty of other leaders of churches who believe this, and the early ecclesia felt this as well. So what I'm suggesting is, as we read these texts, we should read this rhetoric, this Old Testament and New Testament references to the day of the Lord or the second coming, or I'm hastening, the day of judgment is imminent or near. We should read this as continuity through the scriptures, as we go through the Old Testament, as we go through the New Testament, as we read the Book of Mormon, and as we read Doctrine and Covenants. There's a lot of rhetoric which very consistently works through in these Day of the Lord type references. So in Doctrine and Covenants section 1, where it quotes Isaiah, we should read that in the context of what Isaiah was talking about at that time. So we can look at that chapter of Isaiah and say, oh, this chapter is talking about the redemption of Israel and the necessity of that redemption occurring so that the Lord can keep the covenant that he made with Abraham, and that the church, part of the church's participation, part of the ecclesia's participation, is the necessity of redeeming Israel and so that the Lord can keep that covenant. So the missionary work is tied into the redemption of Israel. So when we read these references about the day of the Lord or second coming, then we should see this as consistency through all of the scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, in these latter days, as opposed to reading them as something new and different and imminent and referring to now. Because the truth is for the past 2,000 years, everybody, all of Christianity has expected the second coming to be now. Like for the past 2,000 years, ever since Christ was crucified, everybody has thought the second coming was in their lifetime. And so we do too. And it's like, okay, but we need to temper that with the reality that it hasn't happened for the past 2,000 years. And yes, it will happen, right? But we don't know when. And it'll happen when the Lord sees fit, not when we see fit. So again, what I'm saying is when we read this apocalyptic type literature, what we should do is see this as continuity through all of the scriptures, as opposed to something new and different that refers to us now. Okay, so it's, don't read this as imminent, like in our lifetime. See this as continuity through a series of texts. Okay, so for some historical context to Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, the tone is likely reactionary to the recent apostasies of Ezra Booth and Simmons Ryder, both of whom had very recently in the November 1831 timeframe, right? Recently taken to publicly attacking the church by publishing letters in local newspapers. So if we take a look at the saints, so here's the book that the church has recently published and is coming out to fill in some of the church history. So in volume 1, pages 140 through 141, it talks a little bit more about that. And then there's another book which I'll talk about when I get into the show and tell, which gets into more detail. The following month, after the publication of Booth's letters and during the publication of Ryder's letters in the newspapers, the Lord commands Joseph and Signy Rigdon to, quote, confound your enemies. And we see that in Doctrine and Covenants 71, 7 through 10. So the Lord is saying, look, these people are coming after us. They're disparaging us. Don't tolerate this. Call them to account and show them that they're false, that the allegations they're making are lies. Ryder's published letter, reprinted a week later in a second local paper, is largely a quotation of the text of Doctrine and Covenants 42, the law of the church, with a brief preface stating he is exposing what was to be held secret. So the general historical assumption, when historians read that and try and figure out what Ryder was getting at, the likely intent here is that Ryder was implying that Smith was trying to enrich himself by getting people to donate their goods and consecrating their property and their stuff to the church, because this was kind of an issue among the Campbellites at the time. So Simmons Ryder was likely trying to embarrass or by exposing the text of section 42. He was trying to embarrass Smith and trying to call him to account for trying to enrich himself or something like that. Never mind that the ancient church 2,000 years earlier lived what we would see as the law of consecration. Set that aside. But in any case, Booth's published letters, were largely a bunch of rambling attacks on early church leaders and talking disparagingly about various events, because Booth traveled down to Missouri and then came back again, he didn't really do the missionary work he was called to do. He did a little bit of it, but mostly he's griping about how things didn't work out the way that he expected or they expected. And he says a lot of unflattering things about Smith and Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery. And he also includes the text of some revelations as well. So, so for that historical context, when the church publishes the revelations with the intent of publishing them, it's the church taking control of their texts and challenging those who would attempt to undermine the church when they try to take control of the text and disparage us. So when Ezra Booth takes the text of of Revelations, or Simmons Ryder takes a text and tries to expose it and says, well, this is what it really means, and this is the negative context of what's actually happening. So if the church takes control of it, the church publishes it, then the church is taking that away from these other people who are hostile and saying, no, we're publishing this, this is what we're talking about, here's the context, and here's our message. Okay, so in Doctrine and Covenants section 1, one of the things to notice when you're reading here, in verse 1, right off the bat, this is the Lord speaking in the first person, and the entire text is that way. In a lot of the Doctrine and Covenants, it's a mix of historical accountings or inspired statements by Smith and some quotations by the Lord mixed in. But here with section 1, the entire thing is first person. There's no mixed. This is all of the Lord speaking very authoritatively, stating his position up front with no equivocation. And when you start out with verse 1, it's a summons. He's saying, "Hearken, listen, O ye people of my church. Hearken, listen, O ye people from afar, and all you that on the islands of the sea." Whenever we see that reference, islands of the sea, we should immediately think about scattered Israel. So this is the Lord saying, hey, all of you people, all of the earth, everywhere, I am speaking to you, and you are going to be held accountable for what is written here and what I have spoken. Because when I talk to my servants and my servants say what I have told you, it's the same as me speaking to you. So this is a clear and unequivocating authority statement where the Lord says straight up, this is my work, this is my word, and you will be held accountable for this. And there's nobody there who doesn't fall into the summons when the Lord says hearken. That covers everybody on the whole face of the planet. Okay, so that wraps up my comments on Doctrine and Covenants section 1. So let's do some show and tell here. We have here a photomechanical reproduction of the Book of Commandments. So this is a reproduction that was originally done by the RLDS Church, now called Community of Christ. I believe you can still purchase these over the internet. If you look up, I would just Google search Book of Commandments reproduction. You could probably find some of these either through the church history department or some small bookstores. The last time I checked, some of the I think it was the small bookstore at the Nauvoo historical site was selling these as well. I haven't checked that. I could be wrong. But so this when you have something like this, it's showing you what the original Book of Commandments was like, and the verse breakup was different, and some of the chapter arrangement was a little bit different as well. But this is kind of a neat thing to look through to see what it was, what it was like. And then we have a reproduction of the first edition, the Kirtland edition of Doctrine and Covenants. Now, the biggest difference that you'll see with Doctrine, this first edition, is in Doctrine and Covenants, the doctrine portion is what we would refer to now as lectures on faith. So the doctrine was lectures on faith, and the covenants were these revelations, right? So this part of it is lectures on faith, and then this part of it is the revelations, what we would now see as Doctrine and Covenants in the modern version of it. So Lectures on Faith now comes separate as a completely different book, and it's not part of of our modern Doctrine and Covenants. So that's the one big difference. And again, there are some chapter and verse differences in how the texts are arranged. Now, if you want to dig deep into a completely comprehensive review of all of the, I'm going to try and position this so there's no glare on it. This is a comprehensive review of the publication of all of the revelations in their various forms, all of the changes in the text, and all of that. This is a CD put out by, I think it's BYU Studies, the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for LDS History. This is the PhD dissertation of Robert J. Woodford. It's the historical development of the Doctrine and Covenants, and it comes on a DVD or a CD that has all of the PDFs of all the pages in it, and it goes through in painstaking detail. I mean, this is an extraordinary work where he goes through the history of how, like, when it was published and what version, and all the little changes and differences that occurred in it. So if you really want to do the the deep digging and all that, this is the resource that you're going to want to get. I believe it's still available through BYU Studies. I bought mine several years ago, and it still works. I mean, on a Windows 10 machine, because it's just basically a bunch of PDFs, so you don't have to worry about it not working as you traverse various versions of Windows. And then something else that is less available, these are kind of hard to find. This is a reproduction of the Evening and Morning Star. So this is the newspaper that Phelps printed from Missouri, and because the Book of Commandments was taking so long to print, Phelps started putting the revelations into the Evening and Morning Star. So for a lot of these, the very first time that they were published was in this newspaper format. And then you can look through this newspaper, and you can see, you get a real feel for what the saints were thinking, what they believed, especially when it comes to end times, sort of like, second coming is imminent type stuff. If you take the time to read through some of it, you really get a feel for their point of view and what they were thinking. Like when you read about all of the cholera epidemics and earthquakes around the world, they see this very much as evidence of the end times, the second coming. So this is like some deep dive historical stuff on like the psychology of where the saints were at. Okay, and then I mentioned this earlier. Saints, the church has been putting out a more comprehensive, beefier sets of history as the church tries to grapple with a lot of these historical issues. So this text was heavily influenced by Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling, which I don't have a copy of, but it's also very heavily influenced by this book, which is an even more detailed, heavier, denser read than this one. So if you're reading this one and you're like, I want to know where all this came from, and I want to read more of these first-person accounts and all of the the details, then you're going to want to get this one. So this is Hearken, O Ye People, the historical setting of Joseph Smith's Ohio Revelations by Mark Lyman Staker. The last name Staker, Staker. So this is the deep dive, and this is more of a historical compendium. There's a little bit of commentary where Staker pulls some of the stuff together and presents like likely the likely thought, But more than a commentary, this is a compilation of lots and lots of first person accounts and relevant historical context, like material, like newspaper uh, stuff and journal entries, where he's pulling in stuff that is relevant to the historical context of what's going on at the time. So where Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling is more of a historical commentary, this is more of a historical compilation. So I tend to favor, personally, I tend to favor this sort of stuff um, over a historical commentary. It just depends on how your personal approach to things. Um, I think that kind of covers my show and tell. I believe most, if not all, of this stuff should be available to you if you search the internet. You can check out ABE Books or just Google search. Um, you should be able to find most of this stuff scattered around, and then read it on your own as you're doing your own studies. Um, if you guys ever have specific questions about the history and digging into some of these historical documents, feel free to ask. It's better to contact me directly. I don't tend to read the comments for these YouTube videos because not very many people even watch them and even fewer comment on them. So I don't read the comments. So if you were to post a comment on this YouTube video, I probably won't read it and respond to it. So all you guys from the ward, you know how to contact me at my personal email address, or you can ask questions during the church Zoom sessions. So feel free to do that, and if you have like very nitpicky questions, feel free to ask them. That's the kind of thing that I enjoy running down and digging into the like why did this person do that, and how did we come to the conclusion that this person said that. Feel free to ask those questions, and I'm going to keep doing these videos or I'm going to try to keep doing them once a week, so that in the off week that we're not doing the ward Zoom sessions, I'll still be posting these, so that you guys can refer to them and look them up. Okay, so that's it for this week.